Hello and welcome back to part 2 of this mini-series on creating materials. Today we're going to talk about the fundamentals of landscape materials. Now, believe it or not, I am back inside of Project Aerodel, but I made a brand new level in which I imported a 2K height map. And it's got no material on it yet, so that's why it looks the way that it does. But we still have Aerodel. And Aerodel still has everything that Aerodel has had the ability to do all along. Okay, now if I wanted to, because you already know that I made a material at least a pretty good looking placeholder material for the landscape that we created together in class, and I got my starting textures from Quixel Bridge. So when you do that, you are going to end up with a folder called Megascans, which I'm struggling to locate right now. So I'll open that up. And inside of there, you'll have another subfolder called Surfaces. And then the number of folders that you'll see in here will depend on how many different materials and texture sets that you've downloaded. So I'll open this up, and you can see I've already been doing some screwing around, but there are basically 3 different texture samples here. The first one with that letter D, that stands for diffuse map, which is just another name for albedo map. As a matter of fact, if you read the pop-up, go down to the very bottom right, and you can see that it says 2K albedo.exr. So it's a 2K image, and it is the albedo map, and it happens to be an EXR image. Okay, so that's an uncompressed 16-bit image, which has a lot of color data in it. Okay? Oh, it's saving, but I can keep talking while it's saving. If I were to hover over this, if this were not saving right now, _n usually means it's a normal map, but if this was not in the process of saving, merely hovering over it would, there we go. You can see, look at the bottom. This is the corresponding 2K normal map, and it is also an EXR image. As a matter of fact, this is the normal map that directly corresponds to this albedo map. And the third map is a packed map, and it contains different information in its R, G, and B channels that can be useful as well, but as I said earlier, they're a little beyond the scope of an introductory lesson such as this. Now, if I wanted this to look exactly like what I had in the Aerodel level that we've been working with, I can select the landscape in the outliner, or just by clicking on it, and locate in the details panel where it expects you to input the landscape material. So this is the landscape material that I made, m_my. I added the word my cracked mud ground. And if I place it inside there, it'll think for a moment, and then there it is. Okay, I've got my landscape. And I dare say that it's not bad. Let me just put the sun someplace where I can hate it less. Where are you, son? And while I'm here, just to make sure that this looks pretty nice, I will put in a post-process volume. You can search for that in your Place Actors panel. And let's remember, the first thing that we do when we put a post-process volume inside is we search for INF, which is Infinite Extent Unbound. And we set that to true, and that means that any post-processing effects that we set up in the volume affect the entire world. Okay, so we have a couple of things that I'd like to do in the post-process volume. One of the things is to correct the auto exposure. So I'll type EXP until I get to the exposure area, and I'll click these 3 buttons: metering mode, exposure compensation, and apply physical camera exposure. I'm going to start by setting this to false and changing the metering mode from auto exposure histogram to manual. Okay, and you may notice a slight difference in exposure, but you can set this now to anything you like. Also, what I'd like to do is enable convolution bloom. So I'll just type bloom, and that should take me to where I can set this. Okay, bloom, the method that I want to use is convolution. And you can see it just made the sun look a little nicer. And speaking of the sun, let's do something on the sun, which is the directional light. We can control its intensity, and more importantly here, the source angle is what is going to determine the apparent size of the sun disk in your sky. So maybe we don't want it so bright. Let's see what 2 lux looks like. That's probably too dark. How about 4? And if it turns out that it gets too dark down here, what you can do is go to the skylight, and maybe I could bring that up a little bit more. Let's try 6. You can go to the skylight, and you can increase the intensity there, where it says intensity scale. So let's set that to something like 4. See if we can even that out a little bit. Okay. I'll play the game, just make sure that I can see the character. And maybe what I'll also do in the post-process volume is I'll go back to my exposure. Easy to find it just by typing EXP. And I'll increase the exposure compensation by a little bit more. Metering mode manual. We'll do like that. Okay, that's not so bad. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. I can see the cracks on the ground and all the variation that I put into it. Now, incidentally, when I downloaded this material pack, Quixel will give you a material that it has already put together using these texture samples. So let's clear out my search here and select the landscape and dial down to where we can see the landscape material. I want you to see what they sent initially, and we're going to compare it to my modified version. So let's take theirs and place it into the material slot. We'll wait a second. Okay, doesn't look bad. But if I were to zoom out, I want you to see that this is exhibiting a quality that is considered very undesirable. Hopefully you can tell that I can see that texture repeating over and over and over again. This is a phenomenon, an undesirable one, that's known as texture tiling. Now, if I compare that to my own version, I think that I've disguised the texture tiling pretty well, okay? And I'm going to show you how to make a material like this today. In fact, we can use the same 3 textures and remake this material that I made. I'm going to show you exactly what I did to get this material working. So let's go for it. We'll right-click. And by the way, you can make folders for this if you like, but I'll right-click and I'll make a new material. And I will call it m_demo landscape layer 01 or something like that. We're going to do one landscape layer today, but please know that where we are headed is in the direction of making what's called a layered landscape material, where I can have, some parts be grass and other parts be, let's say, forest floor, and some parts are snow, and some parts are water, and some parts are rock. And we can paint the landscape according to the features that it has and what they need to look like they're made from. But today, what we're going to do today is applicable to any landscape layers that you ever make. Okay, so you can do this to all of your landscape layers when the time comes. So here's our new m_demo landscape layer, and I'll double click that to open it. And it's empty right now, okay? All I've got is the result node. If I hold down Control or Command and then hit the spacebar, I'll bring up a content browser. And I want to make this new material using these 2 textures, the diffuse or albedo map and the normal map. So we're going to select both of them and then drag them right into the material editor. And let's make a little room for them. And we'll start with like basically the most traditional way of starting out a landscape material. You recall that when we were making the other material types, I suggested that you start by right-clicking and typing the word chords. Chords. Keep on hitting the wrong letter. Chords. Or just chord by itself, and you get something called a texture coordinate. It would be usable, but I would rather have you use one that's more optimized for landscapes, and it provides the same its functionality as this, and it's called landscape layer chords. So if I just type landscape, that's all I have to type because I can find it right here. And this is practically the same idea as the regular chords, the texture coordinate node, because it's for scaling UVs. And to scale the UVs, we do it the same way. I can pull off of the I can pull off of the output pin there and search for multiply and select that and provide it with a constant. So I'll hold down 1. I'll set the default value of this constant to 1. If it were set to 0, that would be a problem, because if we multiply the starting UVs by 0, they become 0, and then we wouldn't be able to see anything. So 1 is a decent starting place. And then I'll connect the output of the multiply to the UV inputs of both the albedo map and the normal map, and then we're practically done, because RGB out of the albedo map goes into base color, and the RGB out of the normal map goes into the normal, okay? So this is technically a completed material, and I could put this onto my landscape if I wanted to. So let's find it. It's demo landscape layer, so I'm going to swap that out right now. And technically, this is a landscape, and the UV tiling is all wrong, and it's shiny, and it's nasty in all kinds of ways. So let's open that up and see what we can improve with very little effort. First of all, I don't want it shiny, so I'm going to set the specular to 0. You can parameterize all of these as well, but right now I'm just sort of hard coding it. And I'll set the roughness all the way up. And that's going to help this look more like a rocky foundation, okay? And truly, it does look, ooh, my camera speed is very fast, so let me slow it down. If I get close enough, that's a very good-looking 2K texture, all right? And it's only 2K. It probably doesn't need to be anything greater than 2K. It looks fabulous, okay? However, if I zoom out, boy, do we ever see the texture tiling badly. No matter from what direction I look, the texture tiling is just rather obvious. Okay, so we are going to improve upon that first. And this is going to be easier than you think. So keeping this docked, I think I still have it docked right here. What we're going to do is we are going to disconnect these from the result node for a moment, and also disconnect the UV pins from the output of the multiply. We need a node that's called texture variation. So I'll make some room for it and search texture variation until I find it, texture variation. Okay, so this has some nodes on the left that we may not use all of them, but we're going to be using some of them. The first thing that it wants to know is what are our starting UVs, and we've set that up right here. So I can connect the output of the multiply node into the UV's input. And you know what I think I'll do is I want that to be a little smaller, so maybe I'll just bump that up to 2. Okay, remember, multiplying it by a higher number makes it tile a greater number of times per unit area, making the texture look smaller. Okay, So we've got that. And now I can connect the shifted UVs into the UV inputs of the albedo map and the normal map, and I can reconnect them. Excuse me there, slip of the finger. And apply and save. Now, I haven't even adjusted anything really yet on the texture variation node, but let's see if that's already made a difference. I believe it has already made a difference. The texture tiling is still visible, but it's not as noticeable in my opinion. Let's also check from Aridel's point of view. You certainly can't see it from the player's perspective, and I think that's good. All right, but we're going to still take extra steps because you never know, she might be up on a castle tower or something, and we don't want her looking out over the distance and seeing a tiled texture like this. So we're going to go ahead and continue editing. Many of these pins on the texture variation node are going to come in handy. The variation scale, for example, is a single float value parameter. So I'm going to make a constant for that. And I'm going to sort of copy the default value. If I hover over that, it'll tell me that the default value is 3.24. And I'll match that, 3.24 as a default value, and then connect it. Now in variation levels, it's still a single constant, and the value is 6. So I'll make a single single constant, I beg your pardon, and make the value 6, and I will connect that. Group all these together. I don't have a height map in this case, so we're not going to use this pin, we're not going to use this pin, and we're also not going to use this pin because all of those have to do with the use of height maps, and that is a different lesson. Now, use dither, that parameter is what's called a static bool. So to get that, I need to right-click in the graph and search for static bool. And I want you to be careful because there's a static bool function, and there's also something called a static bool parameter. That's the one that I want, okay? And I'm going to simply connect that where it's supposed to go. So that's going to be this use dither. And we are going to do 2 more of these. So we're going to search for static bool parameter. And 1 more. I know some of you are wondering why I haven't just been using copy and paste and duplicate, but there is a reason that you will see once we start making layered landscapes, because all of these are going to have very distinctive names. So let's plug these in where they belong. And dither, I usually start with that set to false as a default. But random rotation and scale, that's something that I want in my texture variation, so I'll set that to true by default. And then finally, the high-quality edge comparison, I would like to set that to true as well, okay? It would be nice if we knew what these parameters were called while editing them, especially if we make a material instance. That's something that you're going to see in a moment, which allows you to tweak these settings even though we're not in the material editor itself. So let's rename these as parameters. Variation scale, I'll select this node and right-click, convert it to a parameter, and call it variation scale. Now, if I hit enter right now, that would be fine. However, what I'd really prefer to do is to name it according to which layer of the landscape it represents. Okay, so let's find out again what actually is that texture sample. So let's click this. This is cracked mud ground. So I can abbreviate that. I just want to be consistent for all of these parameters. So variation scale, I can modify the name right here in the details panel. mud or cracked mud variation scale, okay? And this will be meaningful to you once we end up having several layers in our landscape that consist of different materials that we build up. So I'm going to do the same thing here. We'll right-click, convert to parameter, and instead of just calling it param, oops, what happened? Undo. We'll rename this crack mud variation levels, like so. This is going to be called, this is already a parameter, so I'm just going to call it cracked mud use dither with a question mark because it's a Boolean. And I have it set to default to false. Set it to false by default is what I meant to say. And on this parameter, it's going to be cracked mud. Random rotation and scale. Hope I spoke. And scale. And straighten this out so we don't have too many crossing wires. This is going to become a gigantic graph after a little while. So we'll just try to tidy up a little bit here. Okay. And finally, our HQ edge comparison. We're going to rename this parameter cracked mud HQ edge comparison. And hit enter. And again, that is true by default. Okay, and we'll be able to see the difference in just a moment. Okay, so now I've got a way of controlling all of these parameters. And I can even make parameters from anything here, anything at all on the result node if I need to. For instance, if I wanted to be able to adjust the metallic, the specular, and the roughness using external parameters, I'd be able to just click one of them and use promote to parameter. And now I've got a parameter called metallic. But in any case, I'm not doing that right now. So let's hit apply. Wait for that to compile and save. All right. Now that I've got the adjustable settings, I'm going to take my demo landscape, okay, and this is the material we just made. I'll right-click it, and I want to choose this option here where it says Create Material Instance, because in material instances, it exposes all of those parameters, and you can actually edit them in real time while observing the effect that they have on your landscape itself. The only thing I'm going to modify about the name here, because it does add INST at the end, but the normal naming convention for a material instance is to put an I after the M and before the underscore. So MI, that's my material instance. Okay, so if I double click this, it'll dock, but I can grab the tab and pull it off of the dock and go back to my main viewport. So if it shows up for you like this, just grab hold of this little pane right here and drag it to the left. And you can resize this window any way you like. All of these checkboxes correspond to the named parameters that we created. So I'm going to enable all of them down to here, where it says texture variation, height versus MIP. Actually, I'm not even going to use that. So down to random variation pattern. Okay, so let's get down to ground level, perhaps. And I want to make sure that this is actually what is assigned to my landscape. So I'll make sure that this is my material instance becomes the landscape material. Okay, so that way we'll see these changes happening. in real time. Okay, so going up to the top, we've got cracked mud variation levels. And as I adjust that, you can see with your eyes that certain things are changing. And what I recommend is that when you're adjusting something like this, while you're adjusting it, take the time to, just let go of it and just look at it while it's not in motion, okay? Because it can give you a really strange sort of feeling when you're looking at it while it's moving. So evaluate it by pressing stop once in a while and let your eyes guide you. Same thing for the variation scale. So you can adjust that, but stop every once in a while and look at the different values, okay? And from different points of view. Random stripe offset. So we're randomizing this with each one of these parameters. These are already checked. Now, dither is something that sometimes can make things look better and other times not. Let me see if I can find an artifact that I suspect is being caused by the use of dither in this case. Sometimes they're hard to find. Right there. I just found one. Okay. Do you see this little area right here? That is an artifact caused by the dithering method used by Unreal. This is something that they're going to need to work on. But if I uncheck use dither, you can see that that disappears and we don't have any particularly visible difference, in my opinion, in our landscape. So while I'm at it, I'm going to redock this. And I think what I would like to do is parameterize our base UVs, and this is the wrong material. So hold on a second, cancel. This is our material. And this parameter is the base UVs. So I'm going to promote it to a parameter, convert to parameter, and I'm going to call this base UVs. But I'll precede it again with cracked mud base UVs. If I save this in the master material, it will propagate to the material instance. And now you can see I can adjust the base UVs as well. So I had that set to 2. I can adjust it just by sight. So let me zoom out here. And while I can see some of this tiling taking place, let's find out if making any adjustments will help, okay? For example, if my UVs are like 1.4-ish, I find them less visible. Now let's see if that had a negative impact up close to Aerodel. Not really. I think it looks still pretty good, but now the tiling is less visible. And if I zoom out, I might even be able to observe the other changes that are taking place as I dial in these other parameters. None of these by themselves is going to be the entire picture that eliminates the appearance of tiling, but it's getting closer. And again, yes, I am just doing this purely by sight, okay? And this is quite a bit better than it was, I think. Okay, we're getting closer. We can spend some more time in here trying to see if we can improve things. All right. It's getting harder and harder to see the tiling as I continue to make these changes. Great. All right, so let me save the material instance and playtest it. And this looks fine. Now, it does not look fine off on the hills and mountains, and that's because it's using the same UV scale, and those objects are very far away. There is a way to scale the UVs over distance, but we're not going to cover that today because these hills are going to be made out of a different material layer anyway. But if any of you are interested, it's something that I could show you privately. If you want to use one material but have the UVs scale according to how far away that item is from the camera that you're looking through. Okay, so objects farther away can have a different UV scale compared to parts of the landscape that are closer to you. Okay. And that's a slightly more advanced technique, but if any of you are interested in that, I'll certainly make time and teach that to you. Okay, so let's hit escape. Now this is pretty good. This is pretty good. This is probably a good time to hit save all. Oh, I have to save my level. Okay, so I'll call this outside demo landscape. Outside demo landscape. Okay, that sounds fine to me. Okay, so that's taking a second to save, so I'm going to pause the recording and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back and I haven't done a darn thing here. I'm still we're exactly where we left off. But I still think that we can improve this landscape. So I'm going to go back to my main viewport and find the parent. Okay, so this is a material instance and demo landscape layer. This is the original material that we made today. I'll place that right back in there. Okay. And you'll see what it's changed, obviously, because in the material instance, we've tweaked some settings that aren't the defaults in the parent material. But that's okay, because we're going to now incorporate another technique that is, frankly, going to make it, I think, impossible to perceive any texture tiling by the time we're finished. Okay, so let's double-click the master material to open it, and it's still docked. Okay, so it's right there. And this technique that we're going to use is known as macro variation. And it involves a specific texture. So to start with, I'll make some room here on the left, and I'm going to press the letter T. Okay, that'll get us a texture sample. And I'm going to do that 3 times because we need 3 of them. You could even do it with more than 3 of them, but I think 3 is usually enough for these purposes. Okay, I'm going to move them a little bit more to the left still. Okay, and each one of these is going to get either a landscape layer coordinate or a regular texture coordinate node. So I'm going to stick with landscape layer coordinate, landscape layer coords. And I'm going to need 3 of them, so I can duplicate that, bring it down here, duplicate that, and bring it down here. Get these all lined up. And they're all going to need multiply nodes. Multiply, multiply, multiply. That was easy. I just held down the letter M and left click. Okay, so we'll line these up. And they're going to have different UV scales, each one of these. So we're going to take our starting UVs, plug that into A, and then make a constant for B, plug it in, and we'll fill in the values in just a second. But we need constants for all 3 of these. Like so. The first one is going to be converted into a parameter. So we'll right-click, convert to parameter, and I'll say cracked mud macro variation large. That's a mouthful. And I'll set a value there in just a moment, but I'm going to do this one next. Right-click, convert to parameter, cracked mud macro variation medium. like so. Just tuck that aside for a moment. And this one is going to be called, we'll convert it to a parameter, cracked mud, macro variation small. Okay. Now, what do we know? We know that if the number is smaller, that makes the texture appear larger, right? If the number is larger, it makes the texture appear smaller. So if that messes with your head, you could always replace these multiply nodes with divide nodes. And you could do it the same way so that it's more intuitive in the sense that larger numbers always mean bigger and smaller numbers always mean smaller. But that's not the way I think of it. I think of it as how many times is that texture going to tile per unit area. So if I were to label this 1 and plug that into the UVs, it would tile once per unit area. But for this purpose, for this use case, we are going to set the default value of this first one to something like 0.5. That's a pretty good starting point. The next one, we're going to set an even lower number, okay? And that's going to be called, that is going to be 0.02. And I just realized that my naming is backwards. Remember, larger numbers, this is a smaller number than this. So this is actually going to be, when applied to the UVs of this texture sample, this is going to look small. So if this is supposed to be small, I would say let's set this to 0.5 and set that to 0.02 and set this to 0.005, something like that. Okay, I usually do these in just a different order. Maybe I can still do this just so it makes a little bit more linear sense, so to speak. Okay, small, medium, and large, like this. Okay, so for small, did I do it? Yeah, okay, so this is going to be the smallest in appearance. This will be larger because it's tiling fewer times, and this will be even larger because it's tiling even fewer times. So more zoomed in, so to speak, on the texture. So we can connect the multiply nodes here to these texture samples. Next, we have to do a little bit of arithmetic. So for each one of these texture samples, what we need is an add node, add. You can get the add node by simply holding down the A button and left-clicking. Each one of these is going to need an add. And I'll get to them in a second, but it just occurred to me that we never selected our texture that we need for each of these texture samples. And this is something that comes with Unreal Engine for free. It's called the macro variation texture. So I'm selecting my very first texture sample node, and here you'll notice that the texture we're using is none. So I'm going to open this up and search for macro. And we want to find the macro variation texture that is in starter content. So find this one right here. And you can see that this is in starter content just by reading the pop-up. Okay, look at the path, the very top line. Okay, so that's the texture that we want to use for all three of these. T macro variation. And again, we want to use the one that's in starter content. And I don't know if starter content. Same for this one. T underscore macro variation. Making sure that we're choosing the right one from starter content. And you can already see that there are three different sort of levels of zoom, so to speak, right? Now we have to add all these textures together. That's going to be the first order of business. And you're going to do it in this way. Do not use the RGB out. You can use the red output or the green output, but not RGB, because this noise texture only occupies one channel. It only needs one channel because it's grayscale. So I'm in the habit of using the red outputs for these, and I plug that into A. Red output into A. That doesn't mean it's red in color, okay? It's just in the red channel, so to speak, okay? Now that we've done that, what we can do is create another scalar. And scalar is like a constant, but it's a way of making a single parameter in sort of one click. If I hold down the letter S and left-click my mouse, I get a scalar. And I'm going to name this macro exposure, like so. This one, I'm going to set the default value to 0.5. You'll see why this is necessary a little later, and that's going to go into the B pin of all 3 add nodes, like so. Maybe I can make some room for it over here. Okay. Next, we need to multiply all of this together. So I need 2 multiply nodes. I'm going to hold down M and left-click here, hold down M and left-click here. So we're going to do it twice. So here's your setup. The output of the bottom add node goes into B of this multiply node. The output of this add node goes into the A. The output of this multiply node goes into B of this multiply node, and the output of this add node goes into the A of this multiply node. Okay, so this is our basic macro variation setup, like so. All right, so now we've got a value here that we want to do something with, and I want to pull off of there. Actually, I may not want to pull off of there yet, because what I want to do first is I want to create a lerp, linear interpolate, okay? And what this is going to do is this is going to give me a way to adjust the, basically the contrast of the macro variation texture. This is going to go into the alpha. This is going to drive the alpha. And A is going to be a color, and that's a constant 3 vector. So I'll hold down 3 and left-click. And personally, I like to leave this blank. A lot of people set this to like 0.5, 0.5. But you'll see I start with it at 0, and then I make it into a parameter just by right-clicking it and convert to parameter. That way, we can adjust it in the material instance. So we'll call this macro contrast, like so. And the default value is black, and you can leave B empty because B should never exceed 1 in a lerp, okay? So now that we've got that, the next thing that I'm going to need to do is probably pull these way over here, because what I now want to do is multiply the output of this texture sample with the output of this lerp. So I can pull this off and type multiply. And instead of taking the RGB out and connecting it directly to the base color, this is going to first go into the B of the multiply. And then finally, that will go into our base color, okay? So now we'll hit apply. Remember, we're still in the master material, but all of this now is going to be inherited by the material instance. And you can already see all these splotches are because of that macro variation. But we can control them better if we do it with the material instance. It's right there, so I'm going to put that back in the material slot. I only had the master material in there temporarily so that I could preview what things were going to look like. So if I open up that material instance, drag it off the dock, and adjust the window so that I can see the parameters. I'll turn on the ones that we didn't have before. Macro contrast as well. Okay, so I think that we've done enough scrambling of the UVs, but what we can now do is we can adjust, while looking at the landscape, we can adjust the appearance of our macro variation. So if I were to adjust the macro variation large value, you can see that that moves the big splotches around. For the macro medium variation, that's the medium-sized splotches. And the mud variation, macro variation small, actually somehow that inherited a very strange number there. So that should be something like I'm going to check this in my master material, but 0.005 should have been the default for that. So let me just double check in the master material if I forgot to do that. This is okay, that's just the material. That's the master. And we're going to look way over here. Macro variation large, 0.005. Small, medium, large. Large, 0.005. Let's set these all back to default for just a second. Maybe my eyes just tricked me here. Okay. So yeah, we went small, medium, and large, so that makes sense. So let's go back here. We still have the material instance applied, and we'll do the large first. Okay, so get that the way you like it. And we've got 3 different levels of this, so to speak. So just dial that in until it looks the way you want for all 3 layers. Okay? Now, the reason that we have this macro exposure and the reason that it's set to 0.5 is because if it was set to 0, it would be very, very dark. And if it was set to 1, it would look like it's very overexposed because it's being combined with that grayscale image of the macro variation texture. So you can think of this almost like an exposure control, and that gives you even more control over the look of your landscape. Furthermore, if we include this macro contrast parameter that we created, I can double-click this, and I can choose how intense I want those splotches to be. And if I don't want them to be all uniform in color, I could even pick a color that's like a dark green or something like that, something that matches more closely to the color of the landscape. I think black works very well, though, because that gives the best appearance, at least as far as my eyes are concerned. So I'll hit OK, and I can close this window. And now let me back up and look around, and I will be damned if I can see any texture tiling anywhere. Okay, that's going to look fantastic, and if I hit play, things look good up close. Maybe what I'll do is I'll change the base UVs a little bit because these cracks look a little bit big. So let's go back into the parent material. And by the way, if you have a material instance in here, you could always double click that and locate the parent material right there. Double click it. And the base UVs, I had that set to 2. Maybe I'll set it to 3 and see if that helps a little bit. Play. Yeah, that's not bad. Okay, so we've got at least one respectable layer for our landscape. This is going to be fun because we are going to, in our next lesson, we're going to create various layers for this that are made out of different stuff. And we're going to learn how to make her footsteps sound different depending on what she's walking on. So if she's walking on this substance, they will sound a certain way. If she's walking on grass, they'll sound a different way. If she's walking on snow, it'll sound different as well for as many different surface types as that we want to include in this layered landscape. Okay? So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you all on Monday. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.